Good afternoon. My name is Meric Gertler, and it is my honor to serve as president of the University of Toronto. At the outset of today's proceedings, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates, and in doing so, I acknowledge also that many of the colleges and universities participating in this initiative today similarly make these kinds of acknowledgements for important reasons at the beginning of their events. In our case, at the University of Toronto, for thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are so grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to a remarkable and vital national dialogue. Events of recent months have profoundly shaken our country and the world. These events have imposed an enormous burden of pain, fear, and anger on our racialized communities that had already been living with these experiences and feelings for many, many years. It is important to recognize a deeper context in which Black people in Canada and around the world continue to be subjected to systemic injustices. It is against this troubling background that I'm pleased to support the work of these national dialogues for action on inclusive higher education and communities. This event builds on a truly national partnership. I understand that there are over 2,000 participants online today, and at last count, more than 40 participating institutions. This is extraordinary and also profoundly hopeful. So thank you to everyone involved. Here at U of T, I want to acknowledge the stellar work of Professor Wisdom Tettey, Vice President and Principal of U of T Scarborough, as well as Karima Hashmani, U of T's Executive Director for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. They described the purpose of these dialogues best when they said that the hope is to facilitate a national conversation that goes beyond talk. The goal is to promote concrete, feasible, and effective actions to address anti-Black racism within our institutions and across our sector. Our conversations will acknowledge painful experiences and injustices, but the hope is that we will also share best practices, discuss strategies for systemic change, and build upon initiatives we are already working on together. I do not expect this to be easy or comfortable, but it is essential and overdue. Let me also underscore that we as public universities have a special responsibility. We must do everything that we can to remove barriers to access, to reach out to communities that have been underserved, and to individuals who may never have even considered higher education as a realistic possibility. This is both a moral and an existential imperative. Racism is doubly pernicious. It is morally abhorrent on every level. It cannot and indeed must not be tolerated. And racism also subverts the very mission of our university. It diminishes us all. In both education and society, our success relies on our ability to draw upon a multiplicity of ideas, perspectives, attitudes, and beliefs. Indeed, achieving excellence as a university or a society depends upon diversity and inclusion. So today's national dialogue is urgently needed. I'd like to congratulate the organizers of this national dialogue for their vision, determination, and success in convening this remarkable gathering. And I thank you all for joining us. Professor Tettey, over to you.
Thank you, Meric. Hello, everyone. It's an honor to join the over 3,000 colleagues and partners who've gathered here today for this historic conversation on anti-Black racism and Black inclusion. This is the first in our series that is focusing on national dialogues on inclusive higher education and communities. I want to add my voice to President Gertler in offering a warm welcome to everyone. Before I go any further, I'd like to extend my gratitude to all of you whose participation has made today a reality. Thank you to our partner institutions from coast to coast to coast. President Gertler, you'll be heartened to know that we're now close to 60 institutions who have answered the call, and many more are represented by individual colleagues. Thank you to our Interinstitutional Advisory Committee, our panelists, our U of T Planning Committee, and the very dedicated and tenacious group of colleagues here at the University of Toronto Scarborough, who has steered us very diligently to this moment. We have come together to facilitate a national conversation and to develop concrete actions for change in our sector. We'll focus on sharing ideas and experiences, exploring and learning from best practices that would lead to verifiable change within our institutions, our sector, and our communities. That journey starts with the humility to acknowledge the reality of systemic racism, the inadequacy of what we've done so far, and a willingness to aspire to a better version of ourselves as institutions and as a sector. This process of acknowledgement may indeed, as the president said, be uncomfortable, but that discomfort pales in comparison to the routinization of exclusion, marginalization, devaluation, and denigration. That is the want of some to promote and the reality for Black, racialized, and Indigenous communities to live. Changing the status quo requires us to critically engage with and to challenge the structural normativity of certain forms of privilege and marginalization, and to embrace how discomfort can in fact be empowering when it is channeled towards the promotion of justice and removal of the venom of anti-Black racism. To get the work done, we have to demonstrate the courage of our convictions regarding equity, diversity, and inclusion, to move beyond the platitude to attitudes and actions anchored in a conscience of equity, a commitment to follow through, and a culture that secures the principles and commitments that we know or ought to know to be right. A good way to approach the task before us is to see one another as equity deserving and to move away from the language of equity seeking. As I've noted elsewhere, that language may have had a well-intentioned provenance, but it inadvertently perpetuates a perception of underrepresented and marginalized groups as interlopers, asking for special favors or concessions. Those on the margins of our community deserve equity as a right. They should not be given the burden of seeking it, and they should not be made to feel that they get it as a privilege from the generosity of those who have the power to give it, and therefore the power to take it back. A rights-based equity-deserving framework comes with the expectation of obligatory reckoning on everyone's part, particularly the powerful and the privileged, to ensure that access to rights is not differentially calibrated based on race. This is not an option or a choice to be exercised. It is an obligation that we must deliver on. A critically minded institution like ours, who pride ourselves as knowledge-creating locations and learning organizations, should take the lead by retiring the language of equity seeking and adopting the more empowering, inclusive language represented by the term equity deserving. This enables our compatriots to take the rightful place as bona fide members of the academy in substance and in fact, not as transactional props or symbols that are only captured on institutional collateral. Black inclusion does not diminish us. It does not take away from any of us. In fact, it enriches us. We have gathered here because we believe that we can transcend what we are today by working together with integrity and honesty, with an eye on concrete actions to forge a better we. And we can only be a better we through oneness of purpose and humanity. If we cede to preconceived, narrow-minded measures of excellence that devalue Black experiences, perspectives, and knowledges, we constrain our ability to avail ourselves of the benefit and impact of their contributions. These dialogues present us with an opportunity to inch closer to our aspirations to be that mature democracy where the humanity of each and all determines our place as bona fide, equity-deserving people, not the color of our skin. We are made better by an openness to learning, by a capacity to be empathetic and understanding, by the power of acknowledging injustices and working towards addressing them. but the fulfillment that comes with lifting one another up, by recognizing that unlearning those things that diminish our common humanity can be the best catalyst for personal growth and the enrichment of communities. It is important that we listen to those who live the reality of everyday manifestations of individual and structural inequality, inequity, and racism. That is why we're anchoring the deliberations and intersecting Black voices and centering them as the takeoff point in all of the concurrent sessions. Expressions of the subaltern voice in articulating these inequalities and discrimination should not be muffled through such coded phrases as cancel culture or identity politics, which terms are deliberately infused with negative connotations aimed at disempowering and eroding credibility. The conversations will be very difficult, but we can chart a path together towards what is just and fair and enriching for all. This work is going to be hard. It'll demand a lot from us and of us. It'll test us, it'll stretch our resolve, but we are among the most prepared and the best positioned to surmount the challenges, to lead and to address the debilitating importance of exclusion, anti-Black racism, and discrimination. We have a unique opportunity here as supporters and beneficiaries of higher education in Canada to deliver on one of the most important manifestations of a truly mature and innovative democracy, an inclusive community that treats all its members as equity deserving. The burden of the status quo is exceedingly heavy on our Black colleagues and communities, but it's not theirs alone to bear or to lift. All of us have to be partners in this effort, genuinely and tirelessly doing our collective and individual part to deliver on the promise of a fair, conscientious, and just society, and a higher education sector where none is unwelcome because of their skin or made to feel like a pariah, an afterthought, and devalued. We're constantly compelled to struggle in order to be included, to be reflected, or to simply belong. That is how we can harness the benefits of inclusive excellence. That journey has to start now in earnest with a sense of urgency. Incremental, piecemeal, half-hearted, reactive, and episodic nudges of the conscience are a luxury we cannot afford. There is justifiable cynicism among both who support this initiative, as well as those who don't. The former cynicism stems from historical antecedents where talk has not translated into sustained and rooted action, where ephemerally tantalizing tokenism has held sway. The second group cynicism is goaded by the belief that the status quo that exclusively or largely benefits them is inviolable because society does not have the temerity to do what is right by all. We need to earn the confidence of the first group through our actions, and by so doing, make it abundantly clear that we're unwilling to continue on a path that makes us poorer because we're holding on to myopic, anachronistic, and moribund appeals to the lowest versions of ourselves, where we think that we can only thrive when others are denigrated or denied opportunity, or that the worth of someone is defined by their structurally constrained circumstances. As educators, we should not squander this opportunity for concrete action, otherwise would irreparably erode the goodwill that members of our community have demonstrated by their participation in these dialogues. We'll be letting ourselves and future generations down. So as we work together to co-create the Scarborough National Charter on anti-Black racism and Black inclusion in Canadian higher education, we need to keep in mind the fact that the Charter is only as good as our ability to deliver on its principles, actions, and accountabilities. So let's proceed with executing them as vigorously and as genuinely as we can within the specific context of our institutions and across the sector. It'll be a guide to set us on a path of success. With this action undertaken in the spirit of the Charter, we firmly anchor our gains whilst nourishing the next set of necessary steps, thereby ensuring that outcomes are sustained and enduring. We have to be informed by what is feasible, but what we define as feasible should not be constrained by what is convenient and easy. We have to do what is necessary to get us closer to the promise of our ideals and values. So let us make this charter an exemplar of what is right and what we can accomplish together when we commit to inclusive excellence that is built in substantive terms on the fundamental principle that all members of our community are equity deserving. Many of us are beneficiaries of past struggles, advocacy, and sacrifices by Black peoples for equity, equality, and justice, which have resulted in the many rights and liberties that seem commonplace today. Our work over the next 2 days will be another one of these efforts that start with Black people's struggle for equity, but redounds to the benefit of all. I wish all of us productive, collegial, and respectful deliberations. Thank you all for answering the call and coming to the dialogues with a commitment to attain the goals that we've set for ourselves within our individual institutions and within our sector. I will now turn the microphone over to my colleague, Karima Hashmani, with whom I've had the pleasure of coordinating the work of an amazing team of volunteers and very supportive partners from across the country. Karima.
Thank you, Professor Wisdom Tettey, for your words and your introduction. We are in a pivotal time in history where we have witnessed the senseless deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rachel Paquette, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many other Black men and women. And the recent verdict of Breonna Taylor has been heavy and impacted all of us. During COVID, we have witnessed disproportionate impacts on the Black community. These injustices highlight our systems that are rooted in discrimination. As a racialized woman and a settler, not being from the Black community myself, I have privileges within our systems that others do not, and I also have a responsibility. Today, not only am I here to listen and learn from the phenomenal Black leaders from various sectors, but I'm here to do the work, as many of you are, to engage in the possibilities of the disruption of our systems, re-envisioning of our practices to be inclusive and accessible, and reviewing these structures that continue to let down the whole community. It's a collective effort, like Wisdom had mentioned, to change these systems, such as our structures, our recruitment practices, mentoring and advancement, and curriculum, and figure out solutions together. We have to understand that we all have rights, but not all of us have access to these rights or can access them in the same way. We all need to engage in the understanding of the barriers that exist. So today is a perfect opportunity where we can develop actions on how to eliminate them, create intentional opportunities and meaningful and sustainable change. Today, we want to seize the opportunity in time where we can host a national dialogue from coast to coast to coast with so many dedicated committee members and over 2,500 participants to generate concrete recommendations for change for the inclusion of Black students, staff, faculty, and community members within our institutions. And not from a deficit model, but one that is based in empowerment and led by the Black community itself. We have developed a framework that I would like to share to help guide us all through the day, where the goal is the co-creation of a Scarborough national charter, principles, actions, and accountabilities to address anti-Black racism and Black inclusion. So if we can bring up that first slide of the framework on the screen. Thank you. Today, we are going to focus on challenges, opportunities, and barriers within our 9 concurrent sessions. We are hoping that during our conversations, you can think about the principles where everyone should have the opportunity to access an education, for example, and using that rights-based approach to guide the charter, which should be followed up with actions. And these actions are rooted in these principles and are key to change. Lastly, we are hoping to focus on accountability. As we all know too well, we can create commitments, but sometimes they just stop at commitments. So we need to have accountability measures in place. And then the next slide of day 2 will focus on the deliberations of today and focus on implementation of goals and actions and the development of the charter. We need to think about these institutional and sector actions, but also the personal. So we may have to connect our barriers and opportunities with our actions in order to make change. So we have to think about our institutional structures, our governing bodies, our Senate, our board of directors, if we're thinking about policy changes, for example. Or we may have to even think of our human resource practices when we are thinking about recruitment. Let's actually think about our timeline. We don't want to think about our timeline for our recommendations. We need to think about if we don't have a timeline, and if we say it takes too long to promote and advance these efforts, then that's an excuse for inaction. And we don't want that here. So we want to make sure we're building our timeline into our actions. And then we want to ensure, again, that accountability mechanisms and measuring our progress and change is important. We need to continue to build trust and transparency through our processes. I hope this gives you some insight into the dialogues and how we are collectively approaching this. The next few days are indeed groundbreaking as we are leading change within our sector and really illustrating our values and putting them into action. The discussions, reflections, and deliberations are important in that they will inform a charter that we can then hold ourselves accountable to, that will be a driver to change the culture of inclusion at every level of higher education. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing the deliberations, the insight, and the wisdom, and very excited to embark on this co-creation of the Scarborough National Charter of Principles, Actions, and Accountabilities with you. Today, we are amongst many leaders that I cannot wait to hear from. I would like to introduce my colleague on the advisory committee for the dialogues, Barrington Walker, who is currently the Associate Vice President of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Wilfrid Laurier University, and who will be leading our first plenary session. Barrington, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Karima, and thank you everybody for the opportunity to speak to you today on the subject of anti-Black racism in the academy, the personal, the systemic, and their intersections. I would first like to thank the organizers and the other members of the National Dialogues, steering committees, and I would also like to thank the University of Toronto at Scarborough for hosting this event and for giving us all the opportunity to engage in a vital set of conversations at a crucial time in our history. Today, I'm going to briefly delve into histories of anti-Black racism in Canada, the structural manifestations of this racism, and its often devastating personal effects, our experiences as Black people in the academy, are the confluence of the personal and the institutional, profoundly shaping our lived experiences in these spaces. So for those of us who are racialized, or for those of us who identify as Black, anti-Black racism has, again, these personal and systemic dimensions. Anti-Black racism has long historical roots in Canada, and by extension, Canada's universities. Anti-Black racism has been a fact of life from the colonial founding of the country to the post-Confederation era. Slavery was practiced across the territory now known as Canada, and post-slavery life was marked by a system of inequality that has been called Canada's version of Jim Crow. Under the system of Jim Crow, the legally supported system of Jim Crow, Black people experienced segregation in schools, they experienced segregation in their neighborhoods, and they were forced into menial forms of work that were reminiscent of the days of slavery. Canadian universities have begun to explore their ties to slavery alongside their role as historically colonial institutions. Dalhousie University and McGill University are prime examples. Other universities have long histories of Black exclusion and anti-Black racism. And Queen's University's expulsion of Black medical students in the early 20th century is a prime example of this. But to their credit, these universities have also spearheaded initiatives such as postdoctoral fellowships, and they've commissioned university-wide research projects as two examples of the sorts of initiatives that are being rolled out across the country to study histories of anti-Black racism in Canada's universities. And these sorts of models, these sorts of initiatives can serve as templates for other institutions who might want to commission similar sorts of projects. And more recent histories of anti-Blackness and Black exclusion can also help us more fully understand the challenges that we face today. They are a bridge from the distant past to our more immediate circumstances. And here I'm thinking of the experiences of Black students who were admitted to Canadian universities in the 50s and the 1960s, a topic that needs further investigation. The paradigmatic story of the barriers faced by students is a Sir George Williams affair in 1969. Students were jailed and deported for engaging in the same sorts of protests that were brewing all over the world. It was seen, that is, the actions of the students, as an affront when it was visited upon Montreal, Canada. So what does the landscape look like today? In 2018, the Canadian Association of University Teachers, a CAUT, published a report entitled Underrepresented and Underpaid, Diversity Among Canada's Post-Secondary Education Teachers. And this study was based on 2017 data. The survey primarily consisted of racialized and non-racialized faculty, and it explored their status in the university. There are, however, some more granular data that can be teased out of the report that allows us to get some insights into the barriers facing Black educators in the college and university sector. So what does the report tell us? It tells us that the numbers of Black educators increased from 1.8 to 2.0% between the years of 2006 and 2016, compared with the growth of labor force participation of 2.2 to 3.1 during the same period. Black educators in the post-secondary sector experienced the highest rates of unemployment at 10.7%. And also, when employed, Black educators at the post-secondary level earned 16.6% less than their white counterparts, although the data also tells us that there are several other groups who seem to fare worse than this. It also appears from the data, and this won't come as a surprise to many of you out there listening today, that Black men are out-earning Black women in the post-secondary sector. There is thus, in short, a history and a present of Black exclusion and marginalization in the post-secondary sector that has a profound effect on the personal experience of Black educators. And as I said at the beginning of this presentation, lived experiences are at the confluence of structural and historical barriers and the day-to-day lived experiences of Black people navigating a system that was founded largely upon their exclusion. And this manifests itself in many ways. Curricular silences around Black experiences and a lack of anti-racist epistemology or ways of knowing. These silences are indicative of a hidden curriculum that tells us what is deemed to be important and what is not. There's also a paucity or a lack of courses on Black experience, histories, cultures, ways of knowing and seeing the world. Black people in universities in Canada also face poor representation at the faculty, administrative, and staff levels, often leading to feelings of marginalization. Black students who do make it to post-secondary education do not see themselves represented in the university hierarchy at virtually all levels, from senior administration positions to frontline staff. And this sends a very powerful message about who belongs and who does not. Overt manifestations of racism and anti-Black racism in particular. Perhaps this is now not quite as common as it was in the earlier university context. Nonetheless, Black students can, and still do, face overt and vulgar forms of racism in the university. For example, racist costume parties, including blackface, have been an ongoing problem at many universities for many years. The surveillance of Black people in campus spaces. Black students, faculty, and staff are routinely profiled and surveilled by members of the campus community, including security staff. Black faculty, for example, often have to pay more attention to our attire so that we are not mistaken for non-members of the university community. And I believe, as others do, that Black women feel this most acutely. In 2019, the issue of surveillance and the profiling of Black people on campus spaces came to national attention at the Congress that was held at the University of British Columbia. Microaggressions. These are the often much more subtle experiences of anti-Black racism that, when accumulated over time, make life unbearable in unwelcoming spaces. Imposter syndrome is a commonly used phrase to describe the feelings of being an imposter in certain situations or roles. This is a common experience of faculty from underrepresented groups who can often internalize the notion that they do not exist in professorial roles, for example. I personally have experienced being told how, quote unquote, lucky I was, not fortunate, not blessed, but lucky to have landed an academic position very early in my career. I do not recall others in my cohort being told the same as routinely as I was. Black people in universities also face a lack of mentorship opportunities and mentorship networks at all levels of the institution. Mentorship networks, as we know, are the key to success in universities at all levels, and without them, it is very difficult to succeed. Mentoring networks are often quite vital for those who are first generation as well, a group that is often overlooked in these conversations, and first generation university students and faculty often intersect with other marginalized identities. And lastly, there is a distinct lack of leadership opportunities. And this really is at the confluence of the personal and the structural. Black students do not get the opportunities to engage in student leadership, particularly at elite institutions. Business schools and law schools are what I'm thinking of here. And Black faculty members are often overlooked for leadership opportunities within their departments. Roles such as department chairs in their universities, or assist at the level of assistant deans, vice deans, and further up the leadership ladder. And it's hard to get leadership positions in universities when you are not considered in the first instance for positions like chair or directorships. And this is a common experience amongst Black faculty. It is the responsibility of universities to recognize these barriers and address them. In sum, there are long histories of anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism in Canada, and these histories have translated into the creation of systemic barriers to Black inclusion in our post-secondary institutions. These historical legacies and their structural manifestations are powerful and pervasive, but they are not insurmountable, as the conversation will show us as it unfolds over the weekend. Over the course of the dialogues that will take place in this conference, we will move from a conversation about barriers and deficits to concrete strategies for action. Thank you very much for listening this afternoon. I hope these remarks give you a few things to think about moving into our concurrent discussion. And that's where we will be moving now, to the concurrent sessions. I will see you there.